Walking with Jesus number 1. Raising the widow's son. A long time ago there was a man who trod the dusty roads of Israel. He brought hope to an impoverished and besieged nation. He performed miracles. He once fed a crowd with a few loaves of bread. He even raised the dead. His renown spread to neighbouring nations, and he was reputed to be a great prophet. His name was Elisha, and he lived around 850 years before Christ. You can read about his exploits in 2 Kings. The Bible record has Elisha mostly around Jerusalem and the Jordan River, between Jericho, Gilgal and Bethel. But he did venture to the fortress city of Jezreel, about 140 kilometres to the north. A well-to-do but childless woman living at Shunem near the plain of Jezreel showed him kindness by providing a room that he could stay in whenever he was passing through. The reward for her kindness was that she and her husband were blessed with a son. This provided for her hope of financial security for the coming years. We are told that her husband was old. Some years later the son became sick and died. The woman searched for and found Elisha, who came to her house, stretched himself over the boy and breathed life back into him. The woman's hope was restored. Heritage is a strong part of Jewish culture, remembering the past, applying its lessons to the present. When Jesus began his ministry, there would have been those who remembered the stories of the prophets of old and saw in Jesus their hope of rescue. Over the next few weeks, we're going to walk the dusty roads of Israel with Jesus. Through our travels, I hope that we will learn some of the common customs of the day, see the law in action, and recognise the love of God expressed to his people. And I pray that we will all grow in our understanding of God and our relationship with his glorious Son, Jesus Christ. We're starting our journey today in Capernaum, a fishing village on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum is believed to have been the hometown of Peter and Andrew, James and John and Matthew, and Jesus has settled there for a time after being rejected at his hometown of Nazareth. Thought to have had a population of around 1,500 inhabitants in Jesus' day, Capernaum is located about 160 kilometres north of Jerusalem. Here's the setting for our story. It's early springtime, about 18 months after Jesus' baptism, in the middle of what is known as his year of popularity. His healing ministry had commenced about 9 months earlier, and he was attracting a crowd wherever he went. A dedicated band of perhaps 70 disciples followed the teacher, but he has chosen 12 to be his messengers. He delivers a momentous oration from a mountainside, a message of hope to a downtrodden and impoverished Jewish people. Returning to his home base in Capernaum, he heals a centurion's servant without even visiting him. People could not get enough of Jesus. So in Luke 7 we read from verse 11. Soon afterward, that is, soon after the healing of the centurion's servant, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. This message can also be titled, A Tale of Two Crowds. Here's the first crowd, the happy crowd. On this particular morning, Jesus set out from Capernaum with his disciples and a large crowd tagging along. What did they do on the way? What did they talk about? We can imagine there were some who sought his advice or clarification of his teaching, perhaps his healing touch. No doubt there were those who just couldn't wait to see what miracle he would do next. Did they know where they were going? Once they passed the turn-off to Tiberias after 3 hours, they must have wondered. Nevertheless, this was a happy crowd, glad to be walking in Jesus' company. Tiberias was a brand new city, established just a few years before by Herod Antipas as the capital of his Galilean realm. Built on the site of an existing Jewish town, Herod increased its population by bringing in Gentiles from many other regions. It was the happening place in the rural backlots of Israel. For liberal Jews, Tiberias represented opportunity, for work and for trade. For fundamentalist Jews, Tiberias was an unclean city because some of its buildings were erected over the site of an ancient graveyard. And for Jew average, Tiberias was an ever-present reminder that they were not masters of their own destiny, but living under the subjugation of Roman occupying forces. With its mix of Jewish and Gentile occupants, one might think that Tiberias presented the perfect stage from which Jesus could launch his mission to save mankind from sin. But it's not recorded that he ever visited there. Jesus' intended destination that day was still some hours down the road, a town called Nain. The word Nain is like the word for pleasant, and apparently that is just how the town could be described. It was a small town situated on the plain of Jezreel. Yes, the same plain of Jezreel I mentioned earlier. How welcome it must have appeared as they approached. We don't know if they stopped on the way for refreshment, but no matter how buoyant they had been at the start of the day, after their 40-kilometre journey, as evening approached, they were no doubt looking forward to finding a meal and lodging for the night. The talk now turned to recalling previous visits, or remembering acquaintances, or asking for suggestions. Nain was not a walled city as such, but houses were built side by side around the perimeter, so that the city could only be entered at the few places where the interior roads found an exit. It was one of these entrances, one normally secured by a gate, that Jesus and his crowd of followers approached. But as they did so, those at the front became aware of sounds, mournful sounds. Perhaps the first thing they heard was a trumpet, or flutes, or the tinkling of small cymbals. Perhaps it was the sound of muffled voices. Whatever it was, they recognized the unmistakable sounds that accompanied a funeral procession. And they stopped, and they watched, as out from the city came another crowd of people, making their way towards the burial area about 10 minutes' walk away. And so we meet the second crowd, the mournful crowd. The first person to appear was probably an orator who was employed to proclaim the good deeds of the dead. Then followed the mourning women hired to chant in weird strains the lament, "Alas the lion! Alas the hero!" or other similar words. Then the mother preceded the corpse, which was carried by friends and neighbours who took turns at bearing the load. They walked in bare feet. After them followed all the other relatives and friends, which added up to a large crowd, probably a major proportion of the population of the town. Why did the crowd behave in such a way? It was believed that the spirit of the dead person hovered over the body for a period of time, up to 3 days, so they must pay their respects while they had the opportunity. There was also a hope that the spirit might be convinced to return to the body. Why would they believe such a thing, that the spirit remained near the body? I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I speculate that they may have relied on stories of people having what we call near-death experiences. From time to time there's been interest in reporting on those in our media. people who have been declared clinically dead and had out-of-body experiences, only to recover and return to their bodies and then recount their experience. I once heard the account of a man who had such an experience. He was a minister in America. In short, he had been confined to a wheelchair and was reluctant to go through an operation that may bring some relief. He had a gun in his hand ready to take his own life when the Holy Spirit convicted him to stop and to proceed with the operation. Lying on the operating table before the surgeon began to cut, he went into cardiac arrest. It was at this point, he testified, that he found himself floating near the ceiling, looking down on the medical staff responding to the situation. They believed he was dead. The usual methods to revive him failed. In a last desperate attempt, one of the doctors jumped onto him to try to get his heart working again. He apparently used some very colourful language in the process, language the patient recounted to him later, to the doctor's surprise. In recent years, medical scientists have found that by electrically stimulating a particular area of the front of the brain, it is possible to affect some of the things near-death people claim to have experienced: travelling down a tunnel, moving towards a light, floating. In other words, this man's experience could be explained by an unusual physiological reaction rather than the hand of God. What it doesn't explain is how, even though this man who couldn't walk didn't have the operation, when he woke up from the anaesthetic, he got out of bed and walked unaided down to the nurse's station. He was completely healed. That was the hand of God. In 1st century Judea, there were no operating theatres and nurses' stations. They knew nothing of electricity, let alone electrical stimulation of the brain. But what they did have was a belief in the extra-natural and in the miraculous. And right now the crowd was doing what they believed to be the right, the only thing in the situation: supporting the loved ones, making a concerted effort to provide the environment for a miracle to happen. Well, a miracle was going to happen, but not in the way any of them would have expected. The dead man being carried out of Nain was not in a coffin as we know it, but in a bier made of wicker, like a large basket. Those carrying it did not touch the bier itself, as that would have meant contact with the dead, rendering them ceremonially unclean for 7 days, and requiring them to undergo a purification ceremony on the 3rd and 7th days. You can read about that in Numbers 19. Instead, they held on to handles. Consequently, the bier was carried low to the ground, not elevated on the shoulders as we are used to seeing coffins borne. The body was laid face up, and, as was customary, the face was uncovered and the hands were folded on the chest. This was the scene that greeted Jesus and his followers, and, as if the sight of this crowd was not mournful enough, Luke tells us 2 very important facts. First, this woman was a widow. Now, what we need to realise is that when God instituted the covenant with his people, the descendants of Abraham, giving them the land of Canaan as their own, it was the men who were in covenant with God. With one exception, it was the men who inherited the portion of land allotted to their families. The women benefited by being in relationship with a man. So if you were a widow or a young female orphan, you could be in dire straits. God's instruction about inheritance is found in Numbers 27 from verse 8. Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, turn his inheritance over to his daughter. If he has no daughter, give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative in his clan, that he may possess it. This is to be a legal requirement for the Israelites, as the Lord commanded Moses. When this woman was widowed, the family inheritance passed to her male children. But the second thing that Luke tells us about her is that this was her only son. She would have been fine as long as he continued to provide for her. But now her hope has died. She has nothing but despair. Her future is in the hands of her husband's male relatives, to whom the inheritance now falls. The widow's situation would have become quickly apparent to Jesus and his followers, but we need to work through the details to understand. As we said, the woman's husband had died and left the inheritance to the son. Jesus addresses the son as young man. The Greek word there is neaniskos, meaning a youth. Still living with his mother, he had no wife to mourn him, nor children to whom his inheritance would pass. He was an only son, so there were no brothers to assume ownership. Finally, the inheritance passes to his father's brothers, his uncles, the widow's brothers-in-law, or other male relatives of his father if there were no brothers-in-law. We know from the Old Testament story of Ruth that the nearest male relative might be interested in taking over the property, but not so interested to take responsibility for the middle-aged woman that goes with it. Do you feel the utter despair and hopelessness facing this woman? The kind wishes of her friends afford little comfort. Her hopes and plans are in that bier, being carried towards a burial plot. Suddenly, through the wailing and weeping, she hears a voice say, "Don't cry." Don't cry, indeed! Of course she will cry. It is what must be done. There is nothing else to do. Yes, she will cry. What's going on? Why have we stopped? Why is that man touching the bier? Outrageous that someone should do this in the midst of her despair. Did he know what he was doing? Yes, Jesus knew exactly what he was doing. He had walked all day to reach Nain at this very moment. He had arrived with a crowd of friends and supporters, people who now were tired and hungry, some of them annoyed by this unexpected delay, some of them looking to Jesus to supply their need. But Jesus stepped out from the happy crowd and joined the mournful crowd. He went right to the focus, to the cause of their grief. He stepped up and touched the bier, something even the dead man's friends wouldn't do. His action was so unexpected, so shocking, that everyone stopped and looked. Then, with utter simplicity, he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." And the young man did. I do not believe it was by coincidence that on that day Jesus walked 40 kilometres to the little town of Nain. I think the reason can be found in Luke chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. The news about him spread all the more, so the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Amidst the clamour and the enthusiasm surrounding him, Jesus deliberately and frequently took time out for refreshment alone in the presence of his Father. He spent time to find out the Father's will, to listen to the Father's voice, to plead for the lost souls around him. I believe that it was an act of premeditated obedience that saw Jesus walk all day just to say those few words. But what a difference they made! Despair was vanquished and hope restored. The crowd who was mourning just moments before now were rejoicing and cheering and praising God and proclaiming that Jesus was a great prophet. If Jesus' reputation was big before, now it was enormous. And because Nain was very close to the ancient site of Shunem on the plain of Jezreel, I do not doubt that there were those who recalled the story of Elisha raising that woman's only son and restoring her hope. Yes, Jesus was at least as great a prophet as Elisha. Yet just a few verses further on in this chapter of Luke, we find a religious leader questioning to himself whether Jesus really was a prophet, because he allowed a known prostitute to wet his feet with her tears and wipe them with her hair and kiss them and pour perfume on them. Again, Jesus knew exactly what was going on. "I have something to tell you," Jesus said to him, and proceeded to cut right to the heart of his prejudice. Now, when I speak of Jesus being obedient to the Father, I don't want you to get the impression that I'm saying that Jesus was some sort of unthinking, miracle-working automaton. Jesus, job card for today, walk to Nain, heal a dead boy, move on. No. Luke tells us in verse 13 that when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. By the guidance and inspiration of the Father, Jesus journeyed to Nain, but it was his own compassion that caused him to act. Next week, we will read of two people who came to Jesus seeking his help. In this story, it is Jesus who takes the initiative. In her grief in the midst of the funeral procession, the woman was probably not even aware that Jesus was there. Sometime later, John records that Philip said to Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father." Jesus' response was, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father," and "It is the Father living in me who is doing his work." When we see Jesus act for this woman out of compassion, we know that the Father's heart has gone out to her as well. I wonder how you respond to this story of the widow's son. Most of us have something that we put our hope in for our future security in this life: our job, our superannuation, insurance, our husband, our family. As this woman discovered, nothing of this world is certain. But if we put our trust in God, all that we need in this world will be provided. In Paul's first letter to Timothy, he gives some instruction concerning true widows, those who have no family to care for them. He says, "The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help." Surely the story of the widow of Nain must have been a comfort and encouragement to any first-century Christian woman in that situation, to know that God does see their plight and is concerned. We read a very important phrase in Luke 7, verse 16. God has come to help his people, they declared. Israel was under the control of the Roman Empire. They were waiting for a saviour, a Messiah who would set them free, just as in the days of Moses. They could draw hope from these words in Exodus. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their cry and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. And when they, the elders, heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. In Jesus' day, the Israelites saw in him their redemption from the Romans. God has come to help us really meant God has come to set us free from our Roman oppressors. The great prophet Elisha had been very well connected and quite politically active. He was in regular communication with Joram, king of Israel. It was rather a love-hate relationship. For a time, Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram to the north, or Syria as we know it, would send raiding parties into Israel. Elisha regularly provided troop movement intelligence to Joram to forewarn him of danger. Elisha gave advice to Joram and the kings of Judah and Edom before their battle with Moab, and he heard from Joram's court when Naaman, commander in Ben-Hadad's army, came to the king seeking healing from leprosy. When he was looking for a way to repay the woman of Shunem's kindness, Elisha suggested that he could speak to King Joram on her behalf. In later years, Elisha precipitated the overthrow of Ben-Hadad of Aram, and he had Jehu anointed king of Israel in place of Joram and Joram's son Ahaziah, both of whom were killed, thus destroying the evil line of Ahab and Jezebel. Would the great prophet Jesus follow Elisha's example and become politically active? After all, King Herod's headquarters in Tiberias were not far from Capernaum, and Jesus had become quite a celebrated personality. In Luke 23 we read that for a long time Herod had wanted to meet Jesus and hoped to see him perform some miracle. No, this was not Jesus' way. In fact, on the one occasion that Jesus appeared before Herod in Jerusalem, having been sent to him by Pilate, Jesus said nothing, despite Herod plying him with questions, despite the vehement accusations of the chief priests. Jesus had to be very careful to not allow the people to be swept away with the idea that he was there to set them free from Rome. Yes, he had come to set them free, but not from human oppression. His mission was a spiritual one. He would only do what the Father wanted. Obedience to the Father was a hallmark of Jesus' ministry. He walked a whole day, avoiding the bright lights of Tiberias with its potential for personal fame, to bring hope to a despairing widow. He walked all the way to the cross to bring hope to a lost world. That also was a premeditated act of obedience. And because of it, we can have a personal relationship with the Father. He calls for us to be obedient to his voice. Will you obey today? The Lord bless you as you consider what it means for you to be obedient.